So I started working with Agile teams in 2003. So almost 11 years ago, we started with a small team, valuing UX right from the beginning, and over the next few years trying to stumble through and figure that out. Over the following few years, I ended up coaching, working with large organizations and trying to figure out how to get them to adopt Agile practices into their organization. And then 3 years ago, my partners and I started ConveyUX, which is a company where we have team as a service, essentially, where clients give us a project. We put together a small team. A minimum team to us is 2 developers, a UX person, and a project manager. Then we go off and develop that project for that client using Agile methods, and I use Agile in quotes more just because of the big A type of Agile. Agile means a lot of things to a lot of different people, and even over the last day and a half of talking with folks, I hear different rumblings about what Agile is in different organizations and what some of your experiences have been. For us, we're a pretty strict Agile shop. Agile to us means that we have a backlog of user stories. A user story can be completed in 3 to 5 days. We plan out a 3-week cycle. The first day of the cycle, the developers and the UX folks and the project managers and the product owners and everybody is in a room. We go through a set of stories, talk through those stories, figure out what we're going to do over the next 3 weeks. At the end of that 3 weeks, then, we do a review, and with the client, we do a demo, talk about what we've gotten done in the previous 3 weeks, and then we also do what we call a retrospective, which is a lessons learned meeting, where the team itself figures out how we can improve and get better. During the development cycle, our developers are focused on following good code craftsmanship, types of practices such as test-driven development, continuous integration, some of those refactoring, some of those practices that make a good team run. One of the things that I've noticed, again, over the last couple of days, is that folks who struggle with Agile, it's probably because the way that Agile is being implemented in the companies has been taken over by the developers, and they're just using it to justify cowboy development, or they don't really know how to implement it. The organization itself has declared that now you all of a sudden are an Agile shop and you're going to figure this out. Those are a completely different set of problems that doesn't have anything to do with Agile and UX and getting them to work together. And so the things that I want to talk about today have more to do with getting UX to work within a well-running Agile shop rather than trying to solve all of the other problems. The years that I spent coaching and going to large organizations to try to get them to figure out how to get that to work is a whole different set of talks, and we're not going to spend time with that today. So 3 years ago when we started ConveyUX, we started with a small project. There were 3 developers, myself as a UX person, project manager, moving along pretty well. And being a small company, we were open to anybody who would give us cash, of course. And so 2 different companies came to me and said, "Hey, Rob, we know that you guys are off doing this project work, but would you mind coming along and helping us with our project just from a UX design perspective?" And so again, being a small company, I said, sure. And so I went off with one group, did some of the background research, ended up giving them some information architecture, wireframes, those kinds of things. They took that, gave it to the developers, who promptly ignored the whole thing. Another group that I worked with, same thing, did some background research, information architecture, gave them the wireframes. They sent the wireframes over to Croatia, who had a development team who followed the wireframes specifically as a specification, as like the list of requirements. Unfortunately, yesterday we were talking about the designer and the engineer. My background is human factors engineering, so as close as I get to a wireframe is a balsamic. So you can just imagine what I got back from Croatia was a whole system that was fully implemented, including cartoon fonts and fat lines. They followed the specification directly. But what was interesting about that whole experience is the contrast between the three different projects. The project that was a Pommiet project that I was fully engaged with, I was able to be there as part of the team. We treat UX as a first-class citizen in the room. We work in a war room. Our remote developers are on Skype all day with us. So we have paper up on the walls and everything that you kind of see in some of the photos of war rooms. That's what our place looks like. So being there as a first-class citizen, sitting at the table with the developers, I'm able to help influence what goes on. And at the end of that project, 6 months in, we were able to release a product that we were all really able to be proud of. So I know that some of you, more than likely everyone's had the experience of throwing something over the wall and having it completely ignored. I'm guessing that some of you in the room here have parachuted in or have been thrown into an Agile world, and you're trying to figure yourself out. So what I'd like to do is just talk through some of the things that work with us, and I'm going to be around the rest of the day and tomorrow, and I'm happy to talk through other things, other issues that you guys are facing. So one of the big ideas with us, or one of the big beliefs that we have, is that things go better when done with others. And we're all about trying to create that team, trying to have that collaboration, working together. We truly believe that having all of those parties at the table together will create a better project. And it helps me personally, as well as the other designers, get our ideas truly out into the world. The developers aren't ignoring them. They're not following them as specifications that really shouldn't be followed. We're working together as a team to get these ideas and this user experience out into the world. And so to me, an Agile way of doing this really fits what we do and fits well with how to get our ideas out into the world. Unfortunately, in an Agile world, there are some challenges. And one of those challenges has been highlighted a couple of times, and that is over the last couple of days, and that is that Agile is developer-centric. Kent Beck wrote the first book that was popular back in 2001 on this whole way of doing things. And he was a developer. He wrote about how the developers worked there at Chrysler. Ken Schwaber came out a year later with another book on Agile software development. And again, he's laying down practices for developers. Neither of them really include UX in their descriptions. And so it has proven difficult to try to figure out how to get this all to play together. Some of the things that UX folks really struggle with at the beginning is the upfront design. We're often used to having a period of time of being able to do some user research, to understand information architecture, to maybe test out some ideas, lay down some comps, prepare quite a bit before a project gets started. For us, a project inception can be 3 weeks, and I need to have some wireframes done within 6 weeks, which we'll talk about here in a second. And so that definitely changes the game quite a bit, and forces us to think about those practices a little differently. Similarly, while you don't have the time up front, you don't have the time to test like you're used to having either. And so these are all challenges that everyone faces. And so hopefully some of these tips that we're going to talk through will at least guide or give you guys some ideas on how to incorporate some of this. So what I want to do is give you 6 tips that we incorporate at our shop Again, this is our way. This isn't the way. This is our way of discovering this after 11 years of practicing and stumbling through and trying different things. Many things, painful times of learning. And it is also assuming that you're working with a well-developed, craftsmanship-oriented organization that values what we're up to. So the first thing that we do is work in parallel with the developers. And what I mean by that is that, again, we start with a project inception cycle. That consists of 3 weeks, a period of time. Our project manager is working closely with the product owner at the client to understand what the requirements are for the system that we're beginning to build. During that time, UX folks are also off doing some background research. Again, you have 3 weeks, so you're doing a lot of lean types of approaches to this. You're probably planning a little bit before that inception cycle starts, at least to begin to line up folks that you want to be able to interview or observe. At the end of that 3 weeks, then there's a pile of stories, and the development team's going to get started. The stories that they typically pick up at the beginning of that will be focused on back-end systems or things that don't have a UI associated with them, basically, which gives us then another 3 weeks to begin to lay down information architecture, to begin to lay down wireframes. And the wireframes that are coming out of that first development cycle will support the stories that they're going to be working on in the second development cycle, right? So we're designing one cycle ahead. And that's about pretty much all the farther that we can keep up on some projects. Often we do try to get further ahead if we can, if we have time. Another tip is to work within the process. And because Agile is developer-oriented, one of the things I want to really try to communicate to you guys is what's going on in the developer's head. If they sit down and go through a cycle planning meeting, and they're looking through a pile of stories, and they're committing to get these stories finished in the next 3 weeks, those stories, we're saying, can be done in 3 to 5 days. So they're pretty granular and focused. They have a description on them and a wireframe associated with them. If a developer comes along and picks up a story and starts developing it and then realizes that the wireframe really doesn't support the interaction that we were wanting to have, they can get a little wound up if we start to try to change things on them a little bit right there on the fly, because their focus is to try to get stuff done. And their focus is to try to get stuff done within 3 to 5 days. And so beginning to work within that process means something like, for example, if I draw a drop-down on a wireframe, and they're working on a story that's around that. And I'm assuming that it's a drop-down because as far as we know, there's 5 values that are going to be in it. And then the developer goes and wires it up to the database and realizes that there's 500 values that are going to go into this drop-down. What do? Well, you could try to design something right there that's a solution that would be more optimal or closer to what you would want. More than likely that is going to take longer than the 3 to 5 days that they were expecting to do this whole story, because of a drop-down they weren't really even thinking about that. So depending on the group that I'm working with at our shop, what I'll do is I'll pretty much just say, just leave it and put 500 values in that drop-down, and then I'll go and write another story, and I'll put another wireframe around that, and then I'll prioritize it to the top so that it gets addressed in the next cycle. For other groups that I've worked with or coached, what I've encouraged them to do is maybe come up with something that's a little not as drastic as 500 things in a drop-down, but still can be completed within that 3 to 5 days that they committed to finishing that story. In either case, what we want to do is understand that what's going on in the developer's head is, I got to get this done, and Rob's about to give me a whole bunch more work. And I don't want that, and I'm going to resist that. And so let's just kind of roll with that. Just say, hey, we're iterating over time. Yeah, we found this problem. Let's come up with a solution to it, and we'll prioritize that and postpone it to the next time. Often we think about UX as this, or any feature really, as this is the only time that this feature is going to get worked on. And in a true Agile environment, people are iterating all the time, and so it shouldn't be a big deal for them to change, especially if they are practicing some of the code craftsmanship types of practices. Change is pretty simple, and they can roll with that pretty easily. A third tip is to use short tests during the cycle, and then do your larger tests outside of the cycle. So what we'll do during cycle, as we're designing for the next cycle, is we'll use A/B testing, some paper prototypes, and just kind of throw those out to folks and see in small sections just to get a little bit of feedback in order to verify that where we're going is a good direction. But we save the larger bringing folks in and doing a real usability test to maybe every 3 cycles, every 9 to 12 weeks, say, get some good feedback in that way. And they're also testing what the developers have built rather than what any kind of prototype. So this next tip is to rely on the information architecture, and this is something that we've developed. It's to me, it's kind of cool. We call it a do-go map, and basically the image on the right there is what we call a do-go map. The cards that are there within this map represent each screen within a system. So you can kind of think of it as a sitemap, maybe a sitemap blended with a flowchart. And so each screen then says, each card then represents a screen and says, what can I do on this screen and where can I go from this screen? And from this, then we can begin to lay down a map of how the overall system's going to work. This is just something that we've developed ourselves. I've had a couple of people encourage me to write something about this and kind of push some of our ideas out, which I am working on. I should say that also on the card here, this isn't in great detail. This is the highlights of what each screen is going to be. And that really kind of segues into the next tip, which is to really treat each design artifact as more of an invitation to a conversation than it is a specification. So to us, a story is just an invitation to a conversation. We're pretty disciplined about our story writing. We follow a template that says, as a blank, as a role, as a consumer, I want to blank, I want to put something in my basket, I want to purchase something in order to, and the why. So as a blank, I want to blank in order to, and the why behind the story. That's kind of a summary statement. There's a lot of details that go behind that. And then this sticky note here that I've got is just kind of something that's up on the wall that represents story 172. It was an 8-point story. And then we go into our online backlog to find all of the details. And then we're connecting a wireframe to that story. So in that cycle planning meeting, we're able to pull up the story, pull up the detail, look at the wireframe. The developers are there to be able to understand what's going on and estimate that story. But even then, when I used to coach teams, I would tell the developers to go pick up a story, go talk to the PO, figure out, or the product owner, the person who probably wrote the story, make sure that they understand it. Then go write the code, then go talk to the product owner, make sure they did it right, and then put it into a test or done kind of state. So it's a conversation that we're trying to have. We're trying to create this collaborative team that we value because we do think that things go better when done with others. Wireframes are also an invitation to a conversation, and I like this combination here because this wireframe here on the left again, was drawn by an engineer. What was implemented is what's shown on the right. If you look at the detail of it, they're kind of directive, but they didn't implement it directly, right? So what was going on is that during the cycle planning meeting, we were able to have a conversation around what is the feature supposed to do, where are we going with this, and then the human factors person sits down next to the UI developer and says, okay, let's do this together. So we're collaborating on it even at that point in time. Again, it's always just an invitation to a conversation. This last tip might scare some of you, I guess, but the idea is to turn developers into designers. And really what I try to do is get the guys to really understand a lot of the little things to allow our UX folks to focus more on the more interesting things. If the developers kind of inherently know where you want to go, or they've learned because of the conversations that we've had, how to pivot and change and do the things, make the decisions in that point in time when they're building stuff, then they don't have to come and ask us how we want to handle it. They can make a good guess. We can test it. We can say, hey, you know what, we'd rather you do it this way, but we don't have to. We don't have to interrupt the flow. They can continue to roll stuff out without interruption. So what I like to try to do is teach them to value people over features, and we all have worked with developers, and so they like the features. They kind of pound their fist over features. To them, the features are what gets them going, and they get excited about that quite often. But what we really want to do is value the people who are going to use this. Secondly, we try to value user feedback over generalized opinions. And I'm sure we've all had conversations where people are pounding their fist again saying, I know based on the 18 people that I've talked to last night at the Super Bowl that this is the way to do this. Of course, that developer was hanging out with 17 other developers when he made that statement, and so he's making this generalized opinion. And what we want to do is get out, talk with people, value their feedback rather than base it on some kind of generalized opinion. Thirdly, developers are just as lazy as everybody else, and they try to build things as quickly and easily as possible for them to build. And so there's tool sets that help them build those things, but those tool sets may not be the best use of, or from ease of use. And so what we want to try to do is get them to value that ease of use and find the fun and the challenge in building something that is easy to use rather than focusing on the features or focusing on getting stuff done and out. And finally, the whole idea of discovery over documentation. Again, it's not to say that documentation's bad, but when you have a developer who says, well, I know that they don't understand this, so I'm going to put this paragraph of text at the top of the page to describe how to use my fill in my form or use my UI. That's probably a symptom of something that's wrong with the UI rather than just a lack of information. And so trying to get them to understand that and value the ease of use and the discovery instead of the documentation. So there's 6 tips that we have incorporated. I know I went through those pretty quickly. I am trying to save a couple of minutes here at the end for questions. One of the things that I do want to highlight, though, is that this is a learning process. One of the most important pieces of the process that we follow is that retrospective, where we as a team figure out how we're going to make this work together. And so every 3 weeks, we're going back through and talking, how did the last 3 weeks go? What can we do to make the next 3 weeks go better? We're never committing to long-term changes. We'll take it in 3-week chunks. That didn't work so well last 3 weeks. Let's try this for the next 3 weeks, and we'll reevaluate then. It's over that time, over the years of doing this and figuring out, trying new things and figuring out what works for our teams, Every project is different. Every team is different. Some practices that we use for one project we may not use on another project. It really is dependent on each team and each client, each project. There's the core set of things like an Agile approach, the code craftsmanship. Those things we don't negotiate about. But in the details of how the process is going, the retrospective really helps us fine-tune the practices that we have. And that's a place where, again, if you guys are in an Agile environment that is practicing Kaizen or the retrospective, as UX folks, you can use that as a platform to begin to try to introduce change and to try to make your processes go a little smoother. I want to end with just a couple of quotes here. Kent Beck, again, he was one of the guys who wrote one of the first books that really took off on this topic back in 2001. And he said, if your stomach knots when you get in the car in the morning, something is wrong with your project, and it's your job to affect the change. So what he's trying to do is say, hey, you guys have to go figure this out. And then similarly, in 2002, in Ken Schwaber's book, he says basically the same thing. The heart of Scrum is assessing the conditions and activities and determining what to do next. This determination arises from experience, training, and common sense. So if you have someone coming along and trying to dictate something onto you and say, well, I read this article in some magazine where this Scrum expert says that you should be able to finish your wireframes and the devs should be able to finish the coding, and we want to do all of that within 3 weeks, you can tell them, well, that's not working for us. And let's try something else, because that may have worked for that person, but it's not necessarily going to work for us. I've had conversations with folks where a friend of mine called, and she wanted me to talk to her manager who was trying to force exactly that on their UX team, where they wanted to have a set of stories at the beginning of a cycle and then do all of the UX work and all of the development work within 3 weeks. And they were wondering why all of the devs only had stuff to do in the last week and why it was taking her so long to get stuff done and prepare for them. So things like that seem like common sense, I guess isn't common. And so let's use those retrospectives and let's think about how things are going and be focused on being productive. We truly do believe that doing things with others makes things go better. Sometimes those clashes can cause conflict, but out of that conflict can often come better processes and better ways of doing things. And again, even as a designer, I feel like that following disciplined Agile methods and practices really does give me an opportunity to see a lot of my ideas get out into the world. So if you guys want to chat anymore, feel free to get in touch with me. I'll be around later today and tomorrow. So we've got about 5 minutes for any questions. Sure.
For you were talking about your minimum team size, but
yes.
What do you find is the sweet spot for your teams?
Okay, so the question is, what's the sweet spot for a team? A sweet spot to me for an Agile team is around 5 to 6 developers, and then the related support staff. So some folks will, in that could be a UX person, a QA person, a project manager. Depending on how productive that team is, it could include even a couple of testers. So when I say 5 or 6 developers, it could be a team of 10 or 12. Sure.
Your diagram looked like there was like 2 parallel teams working, like essentially doing the one sprint ahead and then the current sprint.
Yep.
How do the stand-ups work?
So yeah, that's a good question. So we are a whole team. Everyone's in the war room, the UX folks and the devs. Every day we do a stand-up where we talk about what did we do yesterday, what do we plan to do today, what stands in the way. The developers report on stories. And so if I go back to the illustration, this sticky note would be up on a wall, and the developers will say, I picked up story 172 yesterday. This is how far along I'll get. Hopefully I'll be done by Monday. They'll kind of give that kind of status. The rest of us we're not able to be as detailed. And so we're talking about what is next. we may say we did interview yesterday, or we're working on wireframes for this feature, those kinds of things. But we still talk about what did we do yesterday and what do we plan to do today. It's just not as detailed as what the devs are able to give.
So do you do any estimating for the sprint ahead UX team? Do you guys do any high-level estimating or points estimates, or is that just development?
So the question is, does the developer or does the UX folks do any kind of estimation? And for us, no, we haven't found that we needed to do that. The developers, depending on the project, and again, because we're operating in a pretty smooth running team, at the beginning of a project, we may have the developers estimate, mostly to get an idea of making sure that for our own verification that we are getting those stories small enough and that they are able to complete that. For our guys, probably within 3 or 4 sprints, even the developers stop estimating, quite honestly. And we're just able to get a good feel for what a story is and what they can get done. So, yes?
Can you elaborate a little more on your inception cycle at the beginning? Is that where the wireframes all get developed and ready to get sorted out?
Yeah, so the question is around the project inception. And while I draw it and we talk about it, and as we introduce it to a client, we talk about a project inception being 3 weeks. The project inception is 3 weeks before the developers start, but it's not necessarily 3 weeks before we're ready to do wireframe, or before we have wireframes done, right? So we really try to give ourselves 6 weeks to complete all of that. So during that project inception, the first 3 weeks is when we're off doing observations and interviews, talking with folks, trying to understand what's going on. We will begin to lay down an information architecture. And again, we really do rely on the concept maps and the flow charts, the do-go maps, a lot of that kind of documentation, but it is loose. It's not, it's a guide. It's not a specification. And then that guides and allows us to get into the wireframes. The wireframes in that first 3, that cycle 1, while the developers start building things, we may be able to get more of the wireframes laid out from a framework perspective, right? Where's the navigation? How are those types of things going to work? But really, we want to focus on getting the wireframes ready for the cycle 2 planning meeting. That's the main task. And then if we can get beyond that or past that, then that's a bonus. So, yeah. Oh, wait. Was there another question back here? Yeah, go ahead.
So you said that you had everyone have a war room. Do you also work with remote developers as well? How does that work?
Yeah, so we do work with remote developers. Again, no, we're a small company, and so we're able to kind of stand up, and we're not knocking down cue balls to set this up, right? We've got space set up for developers, and this is the environment that we're in. But our remote guys, we have a couple of guys who are not even in the state, and so they're just on Skype all day long, and they participate. Some personalities will participate a little bit more easily, and you'll just be talking about something, and all of a sudden they'll start talking, and it kind of startles you, and you forget that they're there. For other guys, they can just go the whole day, and you never hear from them except for in their stand-up meeting, but you know that they're there, and if you want to talk to them, you just kind of holler out, and they'll respond. So there was yeah, go ahead.
So on one of your slides, you had I don't know if you call it a wireframe, sort of it's a nautical specification, and then a screenshot of what actually is developed. And I guess my question is, since you've got this team with maybe 5 or 6 developers, you've got a fairly loose first specification, and you try to have the UI person sit down with them, I mean, how do you make that all work within that time frame?
Well, okay, so there's a lot of patterns that exist already, right? So we don't sit down and build this whole screen here. The pattern of the navigation at the top and the secondary navigation in the black down below, that's probably already been laid down. On another story, maybe the navigation there on the those are. Yeah, those, well, that's not navigation, but the selection and the list there on the left could be part of one story, and so we're focused just on that. And then one piece of the interaction there on the right. and then another piece of the interaction on the right. There's a whole bunch of moving parts in this UI, right? There's a drag and drop. There's a lot of data entry, all kinds of stuff going on in there. And so it's each story at a time. So we can have a conversation around this one small piece and then go away. They go and build that over the next 3 days, and then we come back. We don't have to sit there the whole time. We just have a short conversation. They're saying, hey, you've got this list over here on the left. It looks like you want to do this drag and drop thing. How do you want this to go? Obviously, some graphic artists and some other designers have been involved in this to get the colors and the size of fonts and all of that. So it's not one. It's not one.
You would already have your color set out.
Yeah, and a lot of that's done in the project inception cycle also, where we're working with the graphic designers to get that. So I'm out of time. Again, I'm happy to be around. So.